Off the Pilbara coast of Western Australia sits a scattered archipelago of 174 small islands, warm, remote, and surrounded by water, clear enough to draw fishermen and holidaymakers every single year. Locals speak about the place with genuine fondness: quiet beaches, good fishing, the kind of untouched natural beauty that makes for a memorable trip. One local recently described spending his own honeymoon there. What most visitors do not think about while they are standing on that same sand is that the ground beneath their feet was, within living memory, deliberately vaporised by some of the most powerful nuclear weapons ever detonated on Australian soil. If this is your first time on Lost Australia, welcome. Tonight, we are heading to the Montebello Islands, a place still carrying the physical evidence of a secret Britain has never fully explained, more than 70 years later. Between 1952 and 1956, the British government, with the permission of the Australian government, conducted a series of nuclear weapons tests across 3 separate Australian sites: Maralinga and Emu Field in South Australia, and the Montebello Islands off the Western Australian coast. The Montebello tests came first, and the very first of them, codenamed Operation Hurricane, detonated on the 3rd of October 1952, remains a genuinely strange piece of Cold War history in its own right. Rather than being dropped or fired conventionally, the device was placed inside the hull of a decommissioned Royal Navy frigate, HMS Plym, anchored in shallow water just off the islands. The reasoning behind that unusual setup was deliberate, since British authorities specifically wanted to understand what might happen if a nuclear device were ever smuggled into a harbour aboard an ordinary ship. A Cold War fear considered serious enough to justify sacrificing an entire vessel to test it properly. The explosion, triggered 2.7 metres below the waterline, carved a saucer-shaped crater into the seabed 20 feet deep and 1,000 feet across, and vaporised the ship itself almost entirely. That was only the beginning. In 1956, Britain returned to Montebello for a second round of testing, Operation Mosaic, consisting of 2 further detonations known as G1 and G2. The second of those 2, G2, remains the largest nuclear device Britain has ever detonated anywhere on Australian territory, with some estimates placing its explosive yield as high as 98 kilotons, roughly 6 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima in 1945. The decision to allow any of this to happen at all was made with startlingly little public oversight. There is no clear evidence that Prime Minister Robert Menzies formally consulted his own cabinet before agreeing to host the British tests in 1951, and the decision was only made public months later, in February of 1952. Public understanding of exactly what was being planned and what the human and environmental consequences might be remained extremely limited throughout the entire period the tests were actually being carried out. Before we go further, if you had a relative who served in the Australian Defence Forces during this exact period, my guide, Who You Actually Came From, walks you through the free service records that can help you find out exactly where they were stationed. The human cost of the Montebello tests fell heaviest on people who had almost no voice in the decision to allow them at all. The 1985 Royal Commission into British nuclear testing in Australia later found that the presence of Aboriginal people on the nearby mainland and their particular vulnerability to radioactive fallout drifting inland from the blasts had not been properly recognised by British or Australian authorities. That same Royal Commission concluded, decades after the fact, that the Montebello Islands had never actually been an appropriate location for this kind of testing in the first place, citing prevailing weather patterns that made safely containing fallout considerably more difficult than authorities had assumed, and specifically noting that the later mosaic tests had been rushed ahead under genuinely marginal meteorological conditions. Thousands of Australian defence personnel directly involved in the operations were exposed to radiation during this period as well, many working without any real protective clothing at all. A group later found to carry measurably higher cancer rates than the general population in the decades that followed. In 1959, a taxidermist and naturalist from the Western Australian Museum named Kenneth Buller joined an expedition specifically sent back to the islands to assess exactly what the testing had done to local wildlife, collecting and preserving specimens as part of that survey. His first-hand account, still held in the State Library of Western Australia's collection today, stands as one of the earliest genuine attempts to understand the testing's environmental legacy, conducted only a handful of years after the final detonation. If you are finding this as unsettling as I am, make sure you are subscribed, because what researchers have discovered about the islands in just the last few years suggests this legacy is nowhere close to finished. Today, more than 70 years after Operation Hurricane, official visitor guidance for Tremouille and Alpha Islands, the two sites closest to the actual detonations, still recommends limiting time on the ground to no more than 1 hour per day, and specifically warns visitors against disturbing the soil or handling any relics that remain scattered across the landscape. Since 2019, researchers from Edith Cowan University have been conducting an ongoing study measuring exactly how much radioactivity still persists within the surrounding marine sediment, collecting and testing more than 100 samples of sediment and marine life from across the archipelago. In a landmark study published in 2025, lead researcher Madison Williams-Hoffman confirmed that radiation levels found within that marine environment remain approximately 4,500 times higher than typical background levels recorded elsewhere along the Western Australian coastline. That number is difficult to fully process against the island's current official status. Despite carrying contamination at that scale, the Montebello Islands have also been formally protected as a conservation area, recognised for the same rich marine biodiversity that continues drawing fishermen and tourists to its waters every single year. An official marine park sitting directly on top of ground, still measurably affected by the largest nuclear weapon ever detonated on Australian soil. Researchers involved in the ongoing study have been careful to note that the full picture remains incomplete. Williams-Hoffman has described the current phase of research as essentially establishing a baseline, determining exactly how much radioactive material persists in the sediment before the next stage of study can properly assess what that level of contamination actually means for the fish, marine life, and by extension, for any human visitors who might come into contact with it. As she put it herself, You can warn someone away from an area because of radiation risk, but there will always be people determined to visit anyway. A reality that makes properly understanding the actual danger considerably more urgent than simply posting a warning sign and hoping it gets respected. What makes Montebello's story so difficult to fully close, even 7 decades later, is how much of it remains genuinely unresolved. According to James Cook University researcher Elizabeth Tynan, an authority on Australia's nuclear testing history, the British government has consistently maintained tight control over exactly what gets disclosed about these tests, and Australia itself has never had full visibility into precisely what was carried out on its own territory. As recently as 2026, marking 70 years since the largest of the Montebello detonations, reporting confirmed that key documents relating specifically to Operation Mosaic and the G2 test remain formally classified, held under lock by the British Ministry of Defence, still withheld from full public release even now. That combination, a still measurably radioactive marine environment, an official conservation designation sitting directly on top of it, and government records that remain sealed 7 decades after the fact, leaves the Montebello Islands in a genuinely strange, unresolved position. Not an abandoned wasteland cordoned off and forgotten. Not a fully explained, safely closed chapter of Cold War history either. Something in between, a place locals still holiday at, fish in, and speak about with real affection, sitting quietly on top of contamination modern science is still only beginning to properly measure, protected by warning signs asking visitors to limit their time to a single hour a day, guarding secrets. A foreign government has still, more than 70 years on, never fully agreed to share. The scale of the original fallout event is worth sitting with in more concrete terms, since abstract references to kilotons and radiation multipliers rarely convey what actually happened across the surrounding region in the days following each detonation. Nuclear fallout does not stay neatly contained within the boundary of the immediate blast site. Radioactive particles, lifted high into the atmosphere by the force of the explosion, travel on prevailing wind patterns, settling gradually across an area that can stretch for hundreds of kilometres depending on weather conditions at the time. The 1985 Royal Commission's specific finding that the Mosaic tests were rushed ahead under marginal meteorological conditions takes on considerably more weight once you understand exactly what that oversight actually risked. Fallout drifting further and settling more unpredictably across communities and country that had no warning, and in many cases no meaningful ability to evacuate or protect themselves even if they had. That gap between what authorities understood at the time and what they were willing to publicly acknowledge has never fully closed, even decades later. Compensation and formal recognition for Australian nuclear test veterans took years of sustained advocacy to secure, with many affected personnel and their families spending decades fighting simply to have their service, and the health consequences that followed it properly acknowledged by the same government that had exposed them to the risk in the first place. That fight continued well into the 21st century, running in parallel with the same slow, incomplete process of official disclosure still playing out around the Montebello test specifically. For a stretch of coastline now formally protected as a marine park, drawing recreational fishers and the occasional honeymooning couple every year, that layered history sits uneasily beneath the surface, in more than one sense. The fish caught in these waters, the sediment stirred up by every incoming tide, the sand beneath a tourist's beach towel, all of it exists on top of ground that absorbed the force of the largest nuclear weapon Britain ever detonated on Australian territory, radiation levels thousands of times higher than background norms still measurable in the marine environment today. 7 decades after the fact, with the full scientific picture of what that actually means for anyone spending time there still, quite literally, a work in progress. The next phase of research promises to bring that picture into considerably sharper focus. Having established a reliable baseline for exactly how much radioactive material persists across the sediment, and marine life sampled so far, researchers have indicated their next step involves properly assessing the actual biological impact of that contamination, tracing precisely how radiation moves through the local food chain, from sediment into smaller marine organisms, and eventually into the larger fish species recreational fishers regularly take home from these same waters. That work remains ongoing, meaning the honest, complete answer to a question that sounds like it should have been settled decades ago. Exactly how dangerous is it to spend time on and around the Montebello Islands today genuinely does not exist yet in full, more than 70 years after the first bomb went off. Somewhere out past that quiet, sun-bleached archipelago, the crater carved into the seabed by Operation Hurricane is still there too, 20 feet deep and 1,000 feet across, sitting on the ocean floor, exactly as it was left in October of 1952, a physical scar from a decision made without full cabinet consultation, carried out under conditions later found unsafe by the country's own Royal Commission, and still, even now, only partially explained.